Recording is on.
There we are. We're used to that sound. So it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to introduce you all to Dr. Takkara Brunson. I've put her bio in the chat. Some of you will know about her work. I know there's been a lot of excitement about her seminar today. So she's Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University. And her research, as you can see, focuses on the political and cultural traditions of the African diaspora. And the reason that we've invited her, obviously, to the Center for Research on Cuba and the Cuba Research Forum is because of her research profile more generally, but also because she's the author of Black Women, Citizenship and the Making of Modern Cuba. You can read a description of the book in the chat because I don't want to waste too much time. But thank you so much, Takkara. It's really wonderful to have you with us virtually. And over to you.
Yes, thank you. Oh, well, thank you as well, Par, for having me. And thank you to everyone for coming out today. I'm really excited to be here virtually. I'm going to try to share. There we go. All right. So today I will be drawing from my book, Black Women, Citizenship, and the Making of Modern Cuba. The book focuses on the evolution of Cuba's political system between slave abolition in 1886 and the 1959 revolution. In particular, I examine the citizenship practices employed by women of African descent in their pursuit of rights, resources, and social dignity. The first three chapters focus on women's participation in the development of a Black public sphere, especially periodicals and associations. I begin by looking at how Black women imagined their public roles as slavery came to an end, which included critiques of anti-Black racism on the island. I then shift to an examination of the challenges they confronted when claiming rights after the establishment of the Republic in 1902, especially as political elites claimed Cuba to be a racially egalitarian society in which race need not be discussed. The next two chapters of the book show how women of African descent expanded their activism beyond the Black public sphere to also include national political parties, women's organizations, labor unions, and communist groups. Finally, I consider how Black women enacted citizenship following the ratification of the 1940 Constitution. The 1940 Constitution made illegal discrimination on the basis of race and sex, and I trace how women activists of African descent subsequently enacted reform through civic associations, public schools, and at all levels of the Communist Party. Now, several lines of inquiry guided my study of Black women's activism during this period. First, I sought to understand how racial ideologies and gender norms shaped the particular strategies they employed. This required that I identify their public activities across social and political movements. I then compared these activities to those of their Black male and white female counterparts, and I considered what such differences helped reveal about evolving dynamics of race, gender, and class. Second, I sought to understand what the activism of African-descended women revealed about the evolution of Cuba's political system. In the book, I examine connections between activist movements, and I demonstrate Black women's contributions to socio-political discourses and movement building. I also point to some of the limitations of these movements for achieving full social equality. Finally, I wanted to historicize a nuanced, evolving tradition of Black women's activism. Focusing on citizenship practices allowed me to attend to these nuances by acknowledging how class, geography, and political philosophy reflected the experiences of a diverse population. I also attended to the ways that African-descended women's activism compared with that of women throughout the African diaspora. So that is a general overview of how I framed the project and the questions I sought to answer. I will now use the stories of three women from the project to discuss some of my key findings. These women are Cristina Ayala, Maria Damasahova, and Esperanza Sanchez. They were born at different moments between the mid-19th and early 20th century, and their trajectories as public figures demonstrate the complexities of Black women's political activism. In 1878, nationalist rebel leaders accepted the terms of peace proposed by the Spanish colonial government, effectively ending a decade of war. These terms, referred to as the Pact of San Juan, entailed a series of political and economic reforms. The pact granted Cubans new rights to the press and to form associations. New political parties organized to advocate on behalf of an expanding electorate. The government also emancipated enslaved Blacks and indentured Chinese laborers who participated in the war while promising to end slavery altogether. Throughout the island, a small but influential but dynamic group of aspirational Black women embraced these reforms as community leaders ready for the task of building a modern society. Writing for the Black press and creating organizations, establishing schools and libraries, and forming nuclear families, they aimed to break with the social stigma of enslavement in order to receive recognition as racial equals. One such woman was Cristina Ayala. Born into slavery in 1856, the Guinea's teacher and prolific poet devoted her life to serving the population of African descent. In 1888, she outlined a vision of uplift in the poem To My Race. Slavery had ended 2 years prior, unifying recently emancipated Blacks and freeborn people of color under the umbrella category of the colored race or colored class. Abolition, she determined, presented all Black men and women with the opportunity to forge a new life. As she declared, quote, "Now is the time, beloved race, that, our servitude having ceased, we give proof of our citizenship and have a life of our own," end quote. She called upon African descendants to, quote, "look for progress and our moral perfection," end quote. While Ayala directed her poem to the Black population, she also addressed elite whites concerned with the island's social demoralization and incapacity for self-governance. Her poem responded to the pamphlet of Spanish intellectual Francisco Morena, Cuba y su gente, or Cuba and its people, which denigrated Blacks and women of all races for their, quote, immoral behaviors. Ayala challenged his position as she boldly mandated that whites take responsibility for the time that had passed. She blamed slaveholders for creating the circumstances that hindered Black social advancement. She refuted assertions that African descendants were alone to blame for the low marriage rates, levels of education. Yet, even in challenging Moreno, she affirmed his association of moral perfection with marriage and the denial of African culture. Ayala's literary activism highlights the interplay of Cuban national and Black public spheres, both of which expanded following the implementation of post-San Juan reforms. African descendants who received limited opportunities to publish in the national press established more than 120 publications during the final decades of the colonial era. Many served as forums for Black associations. This included the Cienfuegos organization, Daughters of Progress, founded by women of African descent in 1884. Its members included African-descended educators Ana Joaquina Sosa y Gonzalez and Quintana Valle de Vega. Sosa and Valle administered the group's biweekly newspaper, La Familia, the first Cuban newspaper published by women of any race. 4 years later, Black men and women of Havana founded Minerva, a universal biweekly magazine dedicated to the woman of color. Minerva's female contributors focused on asserting the capabilities of Black women in a post-abolition society. Ayala thus represented a community of elite and upwardly mobile African descendants who formulated a platform of racial regeneration, and she wrote for Minerva as well as a range of other Black publications during the period. Racial regeneration discourses responded to the assertions of white elites that Black men and women needed to, quote, prove their merits for racial integration. These discourses outlined a path for moving beyond the perceived darkness under which African descendants had lived during slavery. Racial regeneration advocates utilized the Black public sphere to emphasize socioeconomic advancement through racial unity and personal responsibility. Women who embraced racial regeneration principles stressed their feminine virtue as educated and patriotic citizens. As public figures, they formulated a model of political action in which elite women contribute to the moral, economic, and intellectual development of the Black population. Their actions illustrated and expanded dominant definitions of the culturally refined woman to include African descendants. By the late 1880s, elite and upwardly mobile Black women and men protested assaults on their moral character when they launched the civil rights movement to demand legal protections in education, employment, and public venues. Dealing with racialized attacks on their femininity gradually led many African-descended women away from a model of women's political action that had set them apart from their white counterparts. Throughout much of the 19th century, Black women's public presence as laborers and activists drew scrutiny, as elite whites determined their mobility to be a potential threat to the island's stability. The reforms that characterized the post-Sandjón public sphere prompted women of African descent to realign their public roles with shifting standards of Cuban citizenship. By the 1890s, Black women would be less likely to organize outside of male-headed institutions, while drawing on such institutions to address racial exclusion. The final war for Cuban independence coincided with the Spanish-American War, and subsequently the United States occupied the island between 1898 and 1901. I briefly talk about some of the observations made by women of African descent during this period who noticed that the nationalist goal of achieving racial equality seemed to not be taking place under the U.S. administration that was brought in during this period. The 1901 Constitution granted suffrage rights to all men, regardless of race. Conservative Party leaders and U.S. officials, however, argued that African descendants remained incapable of meeting the standards of civilization necessary for citizenship and were thus a hindrance to national progress. Elite whites projected a white male citizenry that reluctantly incorporated Black men into the public sphere while marginalizing men and women of African descent socially and economically. They mocked the service of Black veterans who confronted high rates of unemployment or found themselves relegated to menial positions while their white counterparts received high-ranking public posts. They invoked the rhetoric of racelessness, that Cuba existed as a society without racial distinctions, to imply that race no longer hindered citizens from achieving socioeconomic advancement. Racial inequities, elite whites insisted, resulted from Blacks' inability to uplift themselves following the abolition of slavery. African-descended women concerned by instances of racial exclusion thus confronted a challenge. Black male politicians were best positioned to address their individual and collective concerns, yet publicly contesting their daily experiences of racial discrimination might lead to accusations of undermining national unity. In the book, I discuss how Black women address racial climate within a climate with racism within a climate of racial silence by writing letters. Some women submitted letters for publication in newspapers of the short-lived Black political party, the Independent Colored Party, or PIC. Black veterans formed the PIC to protest racial discrimination, labor issues, and the failures of the national political parties to address their socioeconomic concerns. In 1910, a senator of African descent passed legislation to ban the party on the grounds that it undermined national unity. 2 years later, protests among PIC members led to a violent backlash from the government, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 3,000 to 6,000 Black individuals believed affiliated with the party. In 1912, that same year, as militias targeted African descendants believed affiliated with the PIC, Ayala wrote African-descendant politician Juan Gualberto Gomez with an urgent request to help her navigate the upcoming exams as the, quote, only teacher of color in the Guinness School District. She sought to wield Gomez's recognized talent, reputable illustration, and incontrovertible influence for her professional advancement, as well as the, quote, honor of our race, end quote. As she explained, most who sat for the exams did not know who would evaluate them and thus could not advocate for themselves. That Ayala referenced the absence of other educators of color highlights the precarious existence of Black women in the field of teaching, a growing sector in which U.S. officials and political elites aimed to modernize the island through literacy and professional training. Ayala appealed to Gomez in the absence of male family members, as she was unable to depend on, quote, good fortune, nor father, son, or husband, end quote. She explained that her sick brother, a member of the Liberal Party, contributed much towards the placement of the members of said party in the Board of Education, which would support her. She cited her brother's contributions to the party in anticipation of the professional benefits that he previously provided for its members. In the book, I examine how she and other women who wrote Gomez, similar to those of the PIC, staked citizenship claims by aligning themselves with Black male voters. And the outcomes varied. Rarely did I find documentation of a response from Gomez, but there were enough letters to demonstrate that he, in fact, did try to help women obtain positions, to enroll in particular schools, as well as to address local issues of racial discrimination that they noted across the island. By attending to women's participation in the turn-of-the-century Black public sphere, I argue that women of African descent adapted racial regeneration goals to fit expectations of racial silence. Rather than publicly address racial discrimination, as many Black women writers had during the late 19th century, most elite women of African descent challenged perception of racial inferiority through the act of writing. Most employed a patriarchal understanding of racial citizenship that venerated Black male political authority. At the same time, the writings of figures like Ayala disrupted notions of a woman's place that lay solely in the domestic sphere, while affirming their familial ties and duties as wives, daughters, and mothers. Cuban women's challenges to patriarchal gender norms continued following the establishment of the Republic in 1902. While men of all races gained the right to vote under the 1901 Constitution, some women protested their disenfranchisement. A small number of women claimed positions as journalists and professional laborers who might leverage influence among male politicians. Most women, however, remained on the margins of Cuban political life. This would begin to change by the 1910s as legal reforms and an economic boom paralleled the emergence of feminism as a framework for interrogating patriarchal dynamics within Cuban political life. Maria Damasahova came of age during this period. Born during the final decade of Spanish colonialism, she lost her grandparents to the Redemptive Revolution for independence. She grew up poor following the death of her parents at an early age. Damasahova obtained an education and began teaching at the age of 13. She founded a school 6 years later. These experiences made her especially attuned to the struggles and needs of the underprivileged. She emphasized her lifelong dedication to creating educational opportunities for, quote, applied and studious children from poor families, end quote. Damasahova in many ways exemplified the vision of racial regeneration articulated by women like Cristina Ayala. Notably, she initiated a workshop that trained students as they published her children's magazine, Ninfas, which she published between 1929 and 1938, as well as a children's radio program. During a period in which African-descended women confronted few opportunities to publish in the mainstream press, she founded the popular culture magazine Umbrales, which she published between 1934 and 1937. Her self-funded initiatives helped launch the artistic careers of individuals who had already achieved financial success, providing those who sought to overcome poverty with a view of a better future. And interestingly, the magazine included a range of authors who included more famous poets like Nicolas Guillen. Of course, he had already gained national prominence by the time that he began to submit some of his poems for publication in her magazine. I argue that Damasahova's literary and educational endeavors demonstrate a shift that took place in the activism of Black women between the 1910s and 1930s. During the 1910s, a small but influential group of elite Black women employed feminist thought as a citizenship practice. They share the goal of integrating women of all races into public life as contributors to nationalist projects. For example, Black feminist Prisca Acosta de Gualba responded to exclusion from white feminist organizations by publishing a column in the Black newspaper Minerva. She and her co-organizers founded an association committed to the, quote, progress of the arts, literature, and sports that would rise to the level of existing feminist groups in cities such as London, New York, Paris, Berlin, and San Francisco, end quote. These women outlined their civic duties as enlightened caretakers whose social roles complemented those of men. In this sense, elite Black women formulated a political agenda that found agreement with white feminist concerns regarding legal reforms, while responding to elite Black goals of regenerating the population of African descent. By the late 1920s, younger African descendants developed a divergent view of political activism that reflected generational perspectives. Having grappled with higher rates of unemployment than older elites, they were more attuned to socioeconomic inequities. This generation of intellectuals insisted that Black elites abandoned outmoded gender norms in favor of new and modern expectations for that of women's engagement, or that included that of women's engagement. Subsequently, women joined men in defending their right to protest racism. Journalist Inocencia Silveira proclaimed, quote, "We are not racist. We are an entity aware of its duties and its rights as free citizens," end quote. The Guana High resident asserted that Blacks only wanted to be able to enjoy the same, quote, "moral and material benefits as white Cubans." For such women, the actions of previous generations demonstrated the worth of African descendants as citizens. Black women's participation in popular class struggles of the late 1920s and 1930s helped accelerate their entry into formal politics. For one, African-descended women professionals forged alliances with elite white feminists and laboring women of all races. These alliances grew into a nationally visible movement for social welfare reform and voting rights among Cuban women. Women achieved suffrage with the ratification of the 1904 Constitution. Second, the reorganization of the labor movement during the mid-1920s and the rise of Marxist critiques of racial, gender, and class oppression among radical activists who acknowledged Black women's persistent marginalization in society legitimized Black women activists' claims to social equality. Yet many whites and African-descended men continued to deride Black women as the carriers of immorality and cultural backwardness within the community of color. Feminists of African descent navigated this context by theorizing the particular experiences of Black women. Writing for columns in the national press, as well as Black magazines that included Boletín Oficial de Club Atenas and Adelante, they emphasized how race intersected with gender discrimination to maintain the impoverishment of African-descended women. Black feminists thus rejected racelessness discourses as they called attention to structural inequities, highlighting how the lack of women's political representation and social equality failed Cubans in general and women of African descent in particular. For instance, Damasahova served as one of several Black women to speak at the 1939 Third National Women's Congress in Havana. The Congress drew attendees from across the island who proposed constitutional reforms on behalf of a broad contingent of women. Damasahova helped outline an agenda for women's advancement and national stability for the Congress in her speech entitled "The Situation of the Black Woman in Cuba." She argued that the Black mother suffered most because she was the mother of the, quote, "marginal Black child, the prostitute, the little newspaper vendor, the gang of robbers, the great number of unemployed and illiterate, and the ill-mannered Black child," end quote. She went on to assert that discrimination within Cuba's schools undermined social equality as they trained Black girls to become ironers rather than professionals. Quote, "When the Black woman is conceded her rights and when there is a sizable percentage of Black women in shops and offices, one can rest assured that women in Cuba are united and that the struggle for their overall betterment and the interests of mothers and children is served," end quote, she contended. Thus, she asserted that any movement to bring about equality must include a commitment to securing the rights of Black women and children. As a public figure committed to defending schools, primary education, veterans, and mothers, Damasahova's paper highlights a rare instance in which a feminist of African descent critically examined the role of white women in the nation's development. As she reiterated points made by Black feminists throughout the 1930s, she asserted that unity among Cuban women could only occur through the elimination of racial discrimination. She asserted that, quote, "the problem of racial discrimination called the attention of white women to the situation of Black women," end quote. She further explained, quote, "one must note that in this fight for the vindication of the white woman, that she holds the greatest responsibility in being able to reject her unjust privileges. She must fight for a redistribution of resources by rejecting her privileges so that the Black woman might receive hers," end quote. She thus implored white women to act on their stated commitment to racial solidarity. Historian Esperanza Mendez Oliva contends that Damasohova's groundbreaking address demanded respect for the intellectual perspectives of Black women, and it challenged white women to act on any cause affecting Cuban women, regardless of their race and color. As Damasohova called for cross-racial unity, she appealed to nationalist discourses and affirmed that racial unity was crucial to the realization of social equality. Damasohova's address highlights that the unification of women of all races entailed a discussion of the rights and social issues that confronted Black women. Many women of African descent shared her concern with the survival of Black families, and they presented these concerns to delegates of the Congress. Yet the societal problems affecting women workers, mother, and children figured prominently in the minds of all reform-minded activists of the era. Indeed, a range of activists that included communist leaders Juan Marinello and Ofelia Dominguez defined women's issues in relation to national progress and shared Black women's interest in labor reform, education, and the development of social services. The Situation of the Black Woman is the only available document in which a delegate specifically addressed the experiences of Black women at the 1939 Third National Women's Congress. However, it highlights how leaders of the National Women's Movement integrated matters affecting women of African descent into their agenda for legal reform. By the end of the 1930s, African-descended women activists sat at the intersection of national women's activism and elite Black men's club activism. At no time were all Black women of one mind about which political philosophy would best help them improve the social status of women. Indeed, while some individuals pursued reform primarily through elite Black associations and women's groups, others joined radical labor and communist organizations. Both groups of Black women forged strategic alliances with white women with the goal of achieving a wide range of reforms affecting African-descended women and their families. Certainly, building coalitions across racial and class differences created moments of tension. And following the 1939 Congress, the vision of racial solidarity put forth by activists like Damasohova remained unresolved. Yet many women of African descent rose to national prominence as leaders within a range of political movements by the close of the decade. The alliances they helped forge would be critical to securing the anti-discrimination clause of the 1949 Constitution. And before I move to the final figure, I'll just highlight a picture of Damasohova with students at her school shortly before her death in 1940. In the book, I talk a little bit more about how a lot of their grassroots organizing actually grew out of their work as educators, not all of the women, but a significant population across the period of study, with the work of Damasohova highlighting the ways that they were moving between the educational realm and then formal political organizations to advance a range of issues that concern them during the period. Born in Eastern Cuba, Esperanza Sanchez completed high school in Santiago de Cuba. She moved to Havana to study pharmacy following graduation. It was during her tenure at the University of Havana that she established her, quote, firm Marxist convictions. Sanchez met the communist leader Julio Antonio Mella and witnessed his work on behalf of the, quote, rights of the people and for national independence, end quote. Perhaps she connected his critiques of capitalism to the concerns of poor women from her family or hometown. Her observation of working class populations in Havana, including their activism during the 1933 revolution, may have led her to sympathize with labor activists. She eventually returned to Eastern Cuba to pursue her profession and to continue her revolutionary struggles throughout the province. Sanchez bridged radical perspectives on women's labor and legal reform with the socio-political agenda of Black civic organizations. She joined the Communist Party, as well as the Communist Organized Radical Women's Union, or URM, and the Provincial Federation of Black Societies of the Oriente Province. The URM promoted gender equality and workers' rights, in addition to challenging U.S. imperialism. Moving between communist, women's, and Black activist movements brought her into contact with a range of social constituencies. Her strategic movement resembled the political activities of Black communist women like the Camagüeyan educator Felicita Ortiz, and both women's work in the Communist Party facilitated their engagement with the anti-racist movement for economic reform. In 1939, The year that the Third National Women's Congress brought together over 2,000 women in support of democratic reform, the Communist Party elected Sanchez to serve as a delegate to the Constitutional Assembly. Subsequently, the party elected her as the first Black woman to Congress. Her ascendance to the national political stage paralleled the peak of communist influence in the labor movement and broader electoral system. The URC gained recognition as the party that ardently defended the interests of women, workers, and persons of African descent. The party's success stemmed from its reciprocal relationship with President Fulgencio Batista. Party leaders mobilized citizens across the island in support of the president's administration. In exchange, Batista supported labor strikes for higher wages. The Communist Party, as a result, empowered African-descended women like Sanchez as political activists who further transformed the nature of the government on behalf of the working classes. Radical Black women like Sanchez employed communism as a strategy for democratic reform between 1940 and the 1959 revolution. Communist activists of all races critiqued capitalist exploitation on the island and globally. Men and women promoted workers' rights, including the right to strike, equality for women and Blacks, government regulation of major industries, including the sugar, tobacco, and railroad industries, and the creation of social welfare programs. Black women communists, as they embraced these perspectives, aligned themselves politically with the laboring classes, whether they were professionals, agrarian or factory workers, or domestic workers, and they called for state intervention on their behalf. Many took on elected positions within the Communist Party during the early 1940s, and they elevated campaigns for anti-discrimination legislation while achieving improved working conditions. With the rise of anti-communism by the late 1940s, African-descended women communists helped refashion the party's image to present its women supporters as the guardians of democracy, both at home and globally. As such, they maintained a political bloc that actively organized women throughout the 1950s. Sanchez devoted substantial energy to the growth of the URC, which was again reorganized in 1945 as the Popular Socialist Party, or PSP. While she rarely discussed issues of racial inequality as a public figure, the Noticias de Hoy interview, which was one of the communist newspapers, shows that Sanchez valued the PSP as a group that enacted social equality. She proudly stated that there existed no racial or sexual discrimination within the organization. She, noting that women historically lacked representation at all levels of government, declared that the PSP fought for the, quote, absolute equality of women and men, the constant battle to achieve and practice the realization of this right and equality, end quote. Sanchez affirmed the PSP as an organization that fought for the abolition of racial discrimination. Further, she critiqued political factions that supported the exploitations of the popular classes, asserting that the PSP was the, quote, only party that loyally defends the popular class economic and social interest, end quote. Sanchez contrasted the socially egalitarian PSP with the discriminatory practices embedded in Cuba's broader political system. Communists elected Sanchez as the first woman to serve in the House of Representatives between 1944 and 1950. She declared her goal to change the political culture by advocating for complementary constitutional laws that would enforce civil rights, promote economic justice through new lease and partnership contracts, and enforce anti-discrimination laws and social security programs. She proposed bills to establish the creation of homeschools, as well as arts and domestic science programs in municipalities across the island. She recommended the creation of rural, technical, and vocational schools to, quote, elevate the education of women and to achieve the improvement of the educational system in the country, end quote. Sanchez also called for special protections for mothers that included maternity benefits and healthcare benefits, and she asserted that breaks for breastfeeding mothers be considered work during their 8-hour shifts. She consistently advocated to have the civil code edited to protect married women. Including rural women in her work, Sanchez proposed medical assistance for countryside workers and a permanent organization to serve their interests. Her proposed reforms aimed to protect women across labor and geographic backgrounds. In 1848, Sanchez spoke on behalf of Cuban communist women during the Second International Women's Congress in Budapest. She issued a critical message for those who view Cuba as a progressive democratic state. Despite the fact that the Constitution contained, quote, multiple provisions and undeniable progress and justice for women to exercise political and civil rights, she claimed that the colonial-era civil codes, which placed women under the guardianship of a male patriarch and denied them legal rights, contradicted the recent text and thus undermined women's equality. Sanchez explained, quote, all our civil law is the hallmark of monarchical conservatism that implanted it on the island, and for the purpose of this legislation, a clear reflection of the times, the woman is a man's property and must act as such. She argued that to address this discrepancy, women presently must move against these colonial legal codes that in practice invalidate our achievements in the first state law with the same impulse that led to our demands for a constitutional assembly. And that was a quote. Sanchez was on a mission in part by, motivated in part by anxiety over citizenship rights. As is characteristic of a capitalist society, she asserted, equality in practice is limited by the prejudices and inferiority maintained and cultivated by the dominant social political regime in our countries. Sanchez contended that marriage, labor exploitation, and racism maintain women's social marginalization. Sanchez issued a critique of social discrimination that departed from the race-neutral rhetoric articulated by most women of the Communist Party during the period, that in general included her, with this speech being one of the few exceptions. She made it clear that racial prejudices, extended and sustained by the dominant classes, maintained the oppressive conditions for thousands of Black and mulatta women. As she poignantly highlighted, quote, dark-skinned women identified as Black or mulatta also suffer from disadvantages because they are women. Yet complete parity between Black and white women does not exist in our country due to their skin color. If Black women are also workers, they suffer a triple discrimination, end quote. Women of African descent, like Black men, continue to struggle with access to employment in stores, offices, nursing, and state employment. And though Cuban law prohibited racial discrimination, Sanchez claimed that employers continued not to hire those struck by the color of their skin. She lamented that even as the Constitution established equality among all Cubans, many possibilities for progress were closed for Black and mulatta women. Sanchez's presentation highlights a rare moment in which she publicly censored the experiences of African-descended women. She noted that the 1940 Constitution, though progressive when compared to other nations, still failed to bring about gender equality. Yet she stressed the intersection of race, gender, and class in defining the experiences of women, factors that most articles of the Cuban communist publications overlooked. Her speech resembled that of Trinidadian communist activist who was based in the United States, Claudia Jones, whose 1949 essay, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, also theorized Black women's struggles at the intersection of racism, sexism, and classism, especially those living in the United States. While Jones is remembered as one of the first women of color to theorize intersectionality, Sanchez should also be recognized for her contributions to framing African-descended women's experiences before global communist circles. Her attention to the plight of Black and mulatta women within a nationalist framework highlights a tradition of Black women's theorizing put forth by Cristina Ayala, Maria Damasahova, and others whose activism I examine in the book. To conclude, I began the project by censoring women and women like Cristina Ayala in an examination of the Black public sphere. In doing so, I show how the women of African descent navigated patriarchal discourses during the late colonial period and the early years of the Republic. Black publications and civic clubs sustained their public activities as white political elites enacted practices of racial exclusion. Yet more than a belief system that maintained women's subordinate position, adhering to patriarchal standards of women's duties enabled Black women to defend their womanhood without violating the tenets of racelessness. Elite African-descended women's investment in sexual morality, exclusivity, and civic leadership that complemented men shaped their engagement in all aspects of Black associational life. I then shifted to examine elite Black women's engagement with feminism, which revealed their entry beyond the Black public sphere and into national political life. Many of the citizenship practices of feminists like Maria Damasahova employed to address systemic inequities took place within the women's movement. Elite women of African descent drew from mainstream ideas of women's roles in their publications and organizing strategies. They also formulated distinct perspectives on national politics. In doing so, they bridged the mainstream feminist movement and Black politics. The issues raised by Black feminists were manifested prominently as part of a national women's platform by the late 1930s, as Black women gained influential leadership positions across women's organizations. Such approaches enabled Black women to forge alliances as public citizens. Finally, I argue that the activism of women of African descent at the intersection of Black civic clubs and women's organizations highlights the overlapping nature of political activity among movements for legal reform. Race was not always central as a mobilizing factor for their activist strategies. Their strategic collaborations with white women and national political organizations, especially in the Communist Party, would continue to expand throughout the 1940s. The Communist Party became a major organization for supporting Black women or women's political activism. This would be framed in relation to the populist discourse that emerged during the late 1930s. Women of all races played a pivotal role in creating this brand. And while figures like Esperanza Sanchez held national leadership positions, women continued to face marginalization throughout the communist movement. Indeed, as I note in the book, most women held leadership roles in auxiliary branches of the Communist Party. Such processes of marginalization shaped the political activism of Cuban women more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Takkara. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I think we've all been taking copious notes, and there'll be lots and lots of questions. What I found really wonderful, and I know it must be very difficult to summarize your book, which is Years of Study. Yep, there is a pause coming.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But more it was. It's very interesting that not just that you've been able to summarize and really, get your arguments across, but it's, you've created this beautiful trajectory through the generations, which is just a lovely historical phenomenon in itself. So each of them embedded in their own context and within the possibilities of their own context. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I'm going to stop recording now, I think, for the questions, if that's okay. You can use the chat. You can unmute yourselves and ask questions directly, however you would prefer. Actually, you know what? I'm going to carry on recording if that's okay with everybody, just because I can think of several scholars in Havana at the Instituto de Historia that would love to hear the discussion that follows your paper. So thank you very much. And over to all of you for questions and comments. Let me just find the chat. So anybody want to start? Tony, over to you.
Oh, hang on. Can you hear me now? Yeah, many thanks indeed for that. It was fascinating. It really was. And I loved the way in which your argument, your narrative progressed very significantly. And you could see the processes of radicalization, the broadening of things and so on. Can I ask you a very technical question? It is, how did you identify these people and how did you get your material? Because the one of the three of them, I'd only really heard of one, which was Mastrapa, the Sanchez Mastrapa. The others were unknown to me, and I noticed that they don't get a mention in some of the other books about Black activism and so on. So tell us how you actually managed to get your information and why did you pick on those?
Yes. So two things I did. When I began this project, was thinking in conversation with the fields of Cuban women's history prior to 1959, as well as studies of race and Black activism prior to 1959. So I combed their footnotes, looking at the different sources that they were working with. I also benefited from meeting with Tomasito at the Archivo Nacional, who handed me one of the bibliographies that he had put together looking at Afro-Cuban themes in history, and was able to identify all of these sources that were written by women during my period of study. And from there, just kind of established like some main archives for beginning to trace individuals. One of the challenges, of course, was figuring out, because of course, during the Republican era, not every person identifies themselves racially. And in fact, most of the time they don't. And so I was able to develop particular networks looking at particular civic clubs in which I knew that they were persons of African descent, rare moments in which they might have identified as persons of African descent in letters or perhaps in an article. And of course, in some of the photographs, not all of them, but in some of the photographs, of course, you can tell who they were and who they likely identified as. And from there began to construct other political communities and to think about how they related to these political communities that previous scholars had already been examining.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for your question.
Fabulous. So I'm going to go straight to the chat, but if anybody wants to raise their hand, that's another way of doing it. Tony, your hand's gone up again, and Jackie also has a question, but I think I'm going to go to the first one that's in the chat, which is from Eloise. Eloise says, thanks for the excellent presentation. Maria del Carmen Barcia, in research from the 1990s, informs us of the 100+ publications of African-descended women. Do you have any idea of how many of these continued for more than a few years or ever achieved prominence like that of Minerva?
So what I found is that if you look at the work of Pedro de Chamchapo, he sketches all of that. And there are again, this was another source, there are certain women who served as editors and contributors multiple times during the late 19th century and then going into the 20th century. Most publications did not last more than a year or so. And so Minerva was a rare instance in which a Black publication ran first for 2 years, excuse me, in the late 19th century, which she looks at in one of her works of the 1990s, and then is published again between 1910 and 1915. But otherwise, most sources don't last that long. I did find that you're able to find a good amount of information about the ongoings of the local Black elites in regional newspapers, in which they may have published social highlights and announcements in those newspapers for much longer than 5 years, and occasionally editorials as well.
Okay, thank you. Eloise might have a comment to make in response to that, but if not, I think it was Jackie who had a hand up. Jackie, I know you're in Havana. You may have connection problems, so we'll just be patient. Oh, here you are. You may have to use the chat because we can just about see you. You're a little bit blurry, but we can't hear you. Hopefully you can hear us. In the meantime, while we wait for Jackie's question, yeah, I can see her signal is coming and going. Other questions, other comments? Can I abuse my position then and ask you a question, Takkara?
Please, yeah.
What I found was really interesting was with your first two figures and the context in which they lived and worked, culture and education were entry points for political activism. It was almost as if it was a safe space in which to become more radical, become more politically active. Is that generally the evidence? And do you think there are other reasons? Because I work in cultural studies and I think that's fascinating because that's still the case in many ways.
Yes, yeah. I think part of it stems from the sources that I chose to use in the book. So certainly with them being of a particular class, either elite or aspiring to for socioeconomic mobility, those tended to be the ways that they could try to demonstrate or assert their respectability and then be accepted in increasingly male-headed political spaces like Black civic clubs and receive validation. And of course, even though many of them gave in to some of the more patriarchal expectations, they found validation in other ways through their connections with Black male activists and politicians. But there's certainly another camp of women who were politically involved during this period and into the early 20th century who were involved in the labor organization or labor activism. I briefly talk about some of them in the middle and latter parts of the book. And they tended to engage in forms of activism that a lot of elite Black activists would not have viewed as respectable, certainly in part because of the forms of activism, but also the communities that these women would have come out of that were more working class, where perhaps they were less likely to be married. Some of them, of course, would have maintained African-based religious traditions. And so what I found is that, there was a lot of engagement between these two communities, perhaps in terms of children who might have attended their schools, living in similar neighborhoods. By and large, it seemed that socially and politically through at least the early 1920s, they seemed to maintain separate realms, especially in Western Cuba and cities like Havana. But your question is also interesting because it's making me think, if one were to do more in-depth work in cities such as Santiago, if we would see more fluidity than I demonstrate in the book during this earlier period. Yeah.
Yep, that is really fascinating. The other thing that occurs to me while you've been talking is that perhaps our divisions between cultural activism, community activism, and political activism are false divisions for the time.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Well, I'm even thinking, one question that I frequently receive when I talk about the project is the role of women who are in these African-based religious communities. And again, the sources that I chose to use, primarily the records of political associations, civic associations, and newspapers, featured Black individuals who at least publicly rarely spoke positively of those communities and practices. But of course, what played out on the ground level in the everyday may have been more nuanced, especially in particular regions. But I think that's a whole other project, which would be interesting because, again, there's probably more fluidity, like you're referencing, among those different camps.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, so we have questions lining up here. I'm going to read out Jackie's because I know she has connection problems. So Jackie first says, I'm interested in hearing distinct features of Black public sphere and white public sphere. And also interested in what you say about how the women were most likely to have identified, particularly in the context of racial mixture. And then we have Jean and we have fellow Jitsa who's going to introduce themselves.
Yeah. Especially during the, thank you for your question as well, especially during the late colonial period and going into the early years of the Republic, I emphasize a Black public sphere as being distinct from a white public sphere because of practices of racial exclusion. So Black women tended to write for the Black press to become affiliates of Black civic organizations because they literally could not be members of most white elite civic organizations. It was rare that they found opportunities to write for even national presses prior to the 1920s and 1930s. And so in many ways, they created their own parallel institutions in which they could have conversations amongst each other as elites and upwardly mobile persons of African descent, outlining their goals for the race, but then oftentimes seeking to create a a particular image that they hope would garner respect from white political elites that would demonstrate that they merited integration into kind of dominant white spaces as well. One of the things that was interesting in looking at Black women's participation in a Black public sphere was that, especially in the 19th century, they tended to engage in forms of public activity that would set them apart from their elite white counterparts. So working period, right? Especially, through forced labor as enslaved persons, but even once becoming free, developing businesses, establishing schools, helping to run the educational system in different parts of the island. And then as a result of that, establishing their own organizations, such as some of the cabildos in the urban areas, but then also later on their own newspapers and civic associations. But as I demonstrate, they moved away from that by the early 20th century and increasingly were seen as being active, at least as the archive shows, in being civically engaged, politically engaged through these male-headed associations up until the 1920s and 30s. And then what was the second question?
Sorry, and how the women were most likely to self-identify, particularly in the context.
Yes. So during the late 19th century, they consistently identified as persons of the colored race or colored class. They occasionally would reference being like Black, mulata, mestiza. By the early 20th century, it was increasingly rare that they would publicly reference their racial identity at all. And so what I had to do was look at the publications that they were writing for, institutions that they belonged to, if they were known Black associations, to get a sense of how they might have identified racially. But other than that, there were many cases in which I came across individuals who I never saw like formally identify as a person of a particular race until much later, even then with it being about them doing so to talk about a particular incident of racial discrimination, or perhaps to help contribute to these discourses of a Black woman's experience by the 1930s.
Great. Okay, we're going to press on just to make sure that everybody gets a voice. So Jean, and then we're going to go to our fellow Jitster. And Jackie says thank you. So Jean, over to you.
Well, hello, Takkara. Thank you very much for your talk. You may not be able to answer my question, so just forgive me for asking. I was very struck by the two 20th century photographs. They're very beautiful, very stylishly taken in terms of photographic technique. I wonder if you know anything about the photographers or the circumstances in which the photographs were taken.
No, so that's my current research, is looking at photography during this period and trying to figure out more about the photographers. Most of the pictures I found did not even note the photographers. With Dama Sahova, she really fascinatingly created her own archive. And so they mentioned some of the photographers who she sat for in the region, but I'm still trying to figure out who they were, whether or not they had their own studios, or if they kind of traveled throughout the region. Occasionally, the Black newspapers and magazines that I consulted would mention photographers and offer discounts, but I'm also trying to figure out more about those individuals beyond just a location.
And do you know if they were particularly photographers of color or not?
The majority of photographers in Cuba at the time would not have been photographers of color, but there were a handful that I've begun to identify who were of African descent. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now I realize it's Leah.
Yes, it's me. I'm joining from my tablet, so I don't know why it said fellow Jitsa.
Fine. Nice to see you, Leah. Go ahead.
Hi, Takkara. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name's Leah. I'm one of PA's PhD students, and I'm looking at proverbs and labor rebellions in Cuba and Tobago. So it's not really questions, really. It's more two comments. So great comment. One, I find it really interesting how, especially with movements towards nation building, and moving out from under British colonialism for English-speaking Caribbean countries, and Spanish and American colonialism for Cuba, how with nation building movements, race always, or people's prejudices, especially along racial lines and gender, how it it seems to kind of fragment these movements. And it's really interesting how the different classes as well, how you mentioned Black elite women in Cuba and non-elites as well, and how people operate within their quote unquote boundary, so to speak, how they protest within and outside of it, and then how they connect with other people. I found that really interesting, and it's something that has built on a lot from what my supervisor's been talking with me about and what I've been reading about as well. And secondly, I was curious, yes, that's my question instead of a comment. Were there any, because I'm interested in orality and songs, proverbs, were there any like songs or poetry that you came across in your project?
Yes, a ton of poetry. Looking at the newspapers, at least a third of the writings that I found from women were poems from the 19th century throughout at least the 1930s, sometimes even beyond that. Dama Sahova was an became like an internationally recognized poet. And you can see that she did a lot of work to advocate for herself to reach that stature. So, for instance, she published her first book of poetry, and then she published a second volume that collected all of the letters she had received from people in response. But those letters clearly showed that she worked on circulating her book of poetry globally. So not just in Cuba, but also to like Spain, France, the United States. I'm trying to think if there were other Caribbean ones. I don't recall at the moment. She also published in Marcus Garvey's The Negro World as well to help disseminate her work to a variety of audiences. So yes, poetry was everywhere. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Fabulous. And we have a question in the chat from RM. I'm wondering if that is Rosa. I'm not sure. But the question is, I'd like to know if you can say a bit more about the family of these women. Were they married? What was their family origin or background?
Yes. It varied. What's fascinating is